Hello and welcome to this session of Gender Studies, where we focus on the social reform movement in pre and post independence India. I am Rushta Siddiqui and I am substituting for the author of this module, Professor Parveen Akhtar Pandit, the controller of examinations, Central University of Kashmir, as we have not been able to establish communication with her for nearly a month. In this session, we will be dealing with changes in the lives of women that have taken place during the pre and post independence periods of India. At the outset, we would like to point out that the changes have their roots in the contemporary socio-political and economic changes of the different time periods we are dealing with. Over the passage of time, a lot has changed in the lives of women. Their social and economic status has changed with the growth of colonialism, Western education, international interaction of activists, and most importantly, government initiatives. Our society has witnessed a lot of social evils and suppression of women in the name of customs, religion, tradition, and culture. The process of emancipation and empowerment of women has been gradual, but the awareness and dissemination of information has been steady. As a result, whenever the government has tried to regulate or legislate and enforce laws that would prevent injustices against women, they have found the activists and social reformers laying the groundwork for the acceptance of the laws. In this module, the objectives have been 1. To understand and know the existing evils in the society and the launching of social reformation movement in India and pre-independence India. B. To analyze the role played by men, women for the eradication of social evils from society. C. To evaluate the social reformation in post-independence period for enforcing the culture of equality. Pre-independence India was engulfed with social practices that subjugated women and assaulted their human rights. Some of the most prominent ones were sati or self-immolation by a wife on her husband's pyre, bal vivah or child marriage, female infanticide, parda, ban on education for women, and widow remarriage. Some scholars credit the international interaction of social reformers who understood the problems and created awareness and situations that were ripe to bring forth changes. Social reformation was the outcome of contact of two different and contrasting societies, namely the traditional conservative and modern free educated society. Some young Western educated Indian men and women, influenced by the liberal and rational thinking of Europe, revolted against the old tyrannical inhuman traditions and practices exercised mostly for women and on women. They started an organized crusade to liberate the society from the age-old clutches of the deadly evils which had devastatingly affected the lives of women. However, in the post-independent period, the new question of social reformation came with the focus on the culture of equality by the women struggling for extrinsic and intrinsic factors to get the due recognition and placement with a fight against crime and crisis committed against women. From the 19th century, however, the women's question had formed one of the major issues in social debate, first amongst social reformers, then amongst nationalists, and finally in the contemporary period among all those who were concerned with the problem of development, of growing inequality, poverty, and unemployment. The methodology used in this module is a combination of empirical and analytical that uses both primary and secondary sources. At this point, we would like to remind you that all the social reform regarding women was not initiated by women. Though the moves were for their well-being, their leaders and supporters were not necessarily women. In the pages of history, we do find traces of some social religious movements in India and some individual efforts of some women who did not comply to certain social evils and practices and traditions. The first organized efforts by a group of people to bring some social change in traditional social structure, institutional arrangements, customs, beliefs, and relationships emerged in the 19th century India or in pre-independence period to post-independence period, however, came from unexpected and unconventional sources. The reform is interpreted as the reconstructing of a particular system and abolishing the earlier one. But the social reform envisages amendment, improvements, etc., thus entailing peaceful crusading, use of non-violent means for change, and change in slow speed. So, it was a gradual change in certain aspects of the society with special reference to women in the context of differences found on the basis of sex, caste, religion, ethnicity, which have created problems and issues for the women and caught the attention of some people who tried to infuse new ways of life and thought to transform the members of society and put preserving the society at large. Social reform movements in India can be divided into roughly 5 phases, 3 prior to independence and 2 post-independence. The social reform movements in pre-independent India can be broken down into 3 broad phases. The first phase is a fight against social evils. Second phase, rise of cultural nationalism and revivalism. Third phase, women participation in the nationalist movement. As mentioned earlier, the gamut of social problems faced by women varied with time. Social customs, practices, and cultural norms and semi-religious myths added to the inhuman conditions of women. A large part of the problem was the lack of education among all sections of society. As the awareness about science, technology, and the women's movements across the world grew, social reformers understood the needs to bring about necessary changes in the Indian context too. We come to the first phase, fight against social evils. The problems of women gained focus during the 19th century as a social issue that had to be addressed and became the foundation for the first set of social reform movements in the country. In this phase, the women's question emerged essentially in the context of the identity crisis of the new and educated middle class, many of them trying to imitate the lifestyles of the colonial rulers found that the condition of their own women to be a stumbling block. The criticism of many of our traditional customs like the treatment meted out to widows, child marriages, the denial of education to women were felt to be blots which earned the criticism of Western commentators. The first generation of reformers were anxious to remove these blots. There were only a few reformers who went beyond the need to imitate the West and began to address some of the other instruments that were used to subjugate and oppress women. The movement started with the active participation of a number of individuals and organizations, and this practically began with Raja Ram Mohan Roy, a social and religious reformer marking the beginning of the modern age of enlightenment. As a social reformer, he fought for the women's cause by eradication of the evil practice of sati and the abolition of caste discrimination by establishing the Atmiya Sabha Association of Friends in 1815. He started Sambad Kaumudi, Bengali journal in July 1819, ceaselessly writing against sati. In 1828, he went against all opposition when he formed the Brahmo Samaj. He faced a lot of hostility and threats from the Orthodox society, but he remained steadfast. As a result of his untiring efforts, in 1825, sati was outlawed with a regulation passed in December 1829 by Lord William Bentinck. Raja Ram Mohan Roy is known as the father of modern Indian history, and was a staunch opponent of polygamy, colonialism, and selling girls in marriage. He also fought the caste system and practices associated with it. He felt that they were meant to provide social comfort to the upper caste and were considered to be undemocratic, inhuman, and anti national. His work was carried forward by Debendranath Tagore, 1817 to 1907, and Keshav Chandra Sen, 1838 to 1884. In 1834, Debendranath Tagore assumed the leadership of Brahmo Samaj and is considered to be its chief architect, and under Keshav Chandra Sen, the Brahmo movement became an all India movement known by the name of Bharatiya Brahmo Samaj, which he joined in 1857 and adopted radical reforms like abolition of parda, caste system, and child marriage. He has been the pioneer of depressed class movement and started educational institutions for women, and the Native Marriage Act 3 was passed in 1872, legalizing the unorthodox casteless marriage and banned polygamy. It also fixed the marriageable age of girls and boys as 14 and 18 respectively. This brings us to phase 2 of the pre-independence social reform movements, or the rise of cultural, national, and revivalism. In the last quarter of the 19th century, the women's question got increasingly colored by the rise of cultural nationalism and revivalism as a counterattack to the spread of Western influences and values, particularly among the educated youth. The revivalists, interested in conserving indigenous cultural traditions, began to support women's education against the attack by orthodoxy on the ground that women's education would help to strengthen the hold of indigenous culture through the institution of family. The growing communication gap caused by only men receiving modern education, in their opinion, was eroding the ability of women to influence the men in their family. Educating them would improve their status within the family and introduce a break on the increasing influence of Western values and culture over the minds of young men. The cultural nationalists thus introduced a new concept into the women's question: women as custodians of traditional cultural values. The voice of dissent was marked during this phase. Writing around the 1890s, Jyotiba Phule, whose primary concern was to break the hegemony of high caste, referred to the subjugation of women as an instrument for maintaining Brahminical dominance in Indian society. During the same period, B. M. Malabari demonstrated for the first time the role that the press could play in mounting a social campaign in the agitation that he promoted for the age of consent bill. For the first time, readers of the Times of India read of real life stories of women who had experienced torture and oppression at the hands of their husbands. Jyotiba Phule, a leading social reformer of the 19th century in India, was from Maharashtra. Along with Justice Mahadev Gobind Ranade, he founded the Satya Shodhak Samaj, Truth Seekers Society. The main objective of the Samaj was to make the lower class people aware of their civil rights and free them from religious and emotional slavery imposed by Brahminical scriptures, and through his writings and deeds, he made continuous efforts to improve the conditions of women and the masses. Through his Satya Shodhak Samaj, he fought for the rights of the peasants and other lower caste people, supported widow remarriage, and propagated them to the remarriage of widows. Henry Vivien de Rousseau, 1809 to 1831, was a young Anglo-Indian teacher of Hindu college who initiated the Young Bengal movement and was joined by many people, mostly Christians. It was a social reform movement against idolatry, polygamy, child marriage, dowry, caste system, and the parda. They supported female education, widow remarriage, individual liberty, and the abolition of sati. They established the Calcutta Public Library in 1935, now known as the National Library, and some of the educational institutions. In this phase, Pratna Samaj, another organization, was established by Dr. Atmaram Pandurang 1823 to 1898 in Maharashtra and in 1867, and as an offshoot of the Brahma Samaj under the guidance of Rana De 1842 to 1901. The Samaj performed an active role in the social reforms emphasizing universal brotherhood and caste equality, protested against child marriage, polygamy, and polyandry. He founded the Indian National Social Conference in 1887 for a combined reform of social and political aspects. His followers established the Widow Remarriage Association, Education Society, and the Depressed Classes Mission was launched in Maharashtra, propagating intercaste dining and marriages, remarriage of boys and girls. Arya Samaj by Swami Dayanand Saraswati 1824 to 1883 was the social reform movement established in Bombay on April 10, 1875 and spread its branches to the whole country. The organization vehemently criticized child marriage, image workshop, and caste system and started a crusade against untouchability and disparity in male and female rights, polygamy, parda, sati. It also worked for the famine relief and spread of education. Theosophical Society was a social reform movement in 1875, started in New York by Madam H. P. Blavatsky and Colonel H. S. Alcott and was shifted to Chennai in 1882. It became an all India movement in 1907 under Dr. Annie Besant in 1933 and focused on the issues of depressed classes, establishment of educational institutions in North and South, founded the Banaras Central Hindu School, now a university, and fought against child marriage. Pandit Ishwar Chand Vidyasagar 1820 to 1891, known as Daya Sagar, worked for the betterment of the condition of the child widows and upliftment of Indian women, remarriage of the widows. Because of his continuous efforts, the government passed the Hindu Widows Remarriage Act in 1856, which legalized the marriage of widows. The first lawful Hindu widow remarriage among the upper caste was celebrated in Calcutta on December 7, 1856, under his supervision. He sternly fought against child marriage, Kulinism, and polygamy. He opened the doors of the Sanskrit college for the lower caste students, especially girls, and set up nearly 35 girls' schools. Kendukuri Veer Salingam 1848 to 1919, a social reformist in Andhra Pradesh, dedicated his life in eradicating social evils like child marriage, dowry, and marriage of young girls with aged persons, corruption, and the system of Devadasis and prostitutes, supporting the cause of Western and vocational education, education of women, and co-education. Several educational institutions were established by him, and as such, and day schools for adult women, night schools for workers, and schools for Harijans were also established. The Widows Remarriage Society in 1881 was established for the remarriage of widows. Vishnu Shastri Pandit, 1827 to 1876, did the same work in Maharashtra. He is known as the Vidyasagar of Maharashtra for his crusade for widow remarriage. Ramakrishna Vivekanand movement of the second half of the 19th century. It witnessed a tremendous upheaval in the religious, social and cultural arena. It was the direct outcome of the Ramakrishna Vivekanand movement. Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa, 1836 to 1886, earlier known as the Gadadhar Chattopadhyay, a great spiritual leader of India. Swami Vivekananda stood for equal rights and equal opportunities for all, and for the all-round progress of all. He was not against anything Western, rather was ready to absorb good elements from them. He insisted that social reform should not be brought about at the cost of other religions, or in other words, at the cost of all the good and great things we have inherited from our rishis. The third phase of the social reform movement in pre-independence India was marked by the participation of women in the nationalist movement. In the third phase, the women question began to get increasingly intertwined with the trends within the nationalist movement. A handful of women got involved in revolutionary activities and challenged their leaders' refusal to allow them to participate fully in the freedom movement. As the movement increasingly took a turn towards mass mobilization, women's participation in increasing numbers became visible and raised basic questions. It is amazing that there is so little investigation of the reasons behind the transformation of what was till then an issue of social reform into a political issue of women's rights to equality. Most people, when asked, will recall women's participation in the freedom struggle, their mobilization by the thousands in Gandhiji's campaign against the British, in the Salt Satyagraha and in the civil disobedience movement, the non-cooperation movements. Others will remember how active they were in the social reform in Bengal, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, and in other parts of undivided India. Names like Preeti Lata, Kalpana Joshi, Satyavanti, Achamma, Durga Ben, Mridula Sarabhai, Sarojini Naidu, Aruna Asaf Ali, Kasturba Gandhi, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, Amu Swaminathan, Lakshmi Sehgal, Mukuntala Sen, Ashok Gupta, like Madam Bikaji Kama, Kamila Tayyabji, the Begum of Bhopal, Mahadevi Verma, Balmani Amma, Matulakshmi Reddy, Pandita Ramabai, Sarla Devi Ghoshal, Anandibai Joshi, Sister Nivedita, Miraben, Annie Besant, and many others come to mind as women who rebelled against living their lives as normally prescribed for women, that is, as daughters, wives, mothers, and sisters. In the late 1930s, a subcommittee on women drew on radical modernist ideas to conceive of women as individuals who should have rights to work, to property, except for the Gandhian interlude. The first three phases of the women's question had focused entirely on issues of women's familial status, their access to education and better legal rights as the instruments of reform. The second part, or the social reform movements after independence, the first phase, or phase 4, is the lull of the feminists. When India attained independence in 1947, at least one promise of freedom was fulfilled and one goal was accomplished: the formal emancipation of women and the granting of franchise to them in their own right. The Constitution recognized the fundamental right of all its citizens, the right to education, shelter, dignity, health, food, and work irrespective of caste, community, color, race, religion, creed, and gender, recognizing the essential equality of all people. In the fourth phase after independence, the women question with regard to social reformation was deemed to have been solved with the adoption of the principle of equality in the Constitution and throwing open to women the rights to education, the vote, and entry into professions, public services, and political offices. This phase benefited a large number of women from this class, breeding them in a complacency and support for the status quo. Women's organizations who had fought for women's rights during the 1930s and 40s settled down to perform needed welfare services for the people with grants provided by the government. For all practical purposes, the women's question disappeared from the public arena for a period of over 20 years. This was reflected in the decline of both research and writings about women during this period. The fifth phase of the social reform movement, or the women run social reform movement, is what we touch on next. The promises of independence and the Constitution were partly fulfilled, and as a result, women today are still unequal and unfree. Unlike the rest of the world, in India, there are more men than women because of the state of nutritional stress. They eat less, they eat last. Only 54% of the women in India are literate. Only half the number of women compared to men are enrolled in school, and many drop out much before they finish, being required to be at home to look after younger children or help with housework. A majority of Indian women are married off by the age of 17. And by the time they are 22, most of them have at least 2 children, if not more. Only 20% are paid in the workforce and paid much less than men, even though there is a law in India that guarantees equal pay for equal work. In the late 1960s and 70s, there was a revival of the women's activism in the country, in what has come to be known as the second wave of women's movement. A series of small and big struggles in Uttarakhand with an anti-alcohol movement led by Sarla Ben and Meera Ben, in Naxalbari in West Bengal, and in Maharashtra with the anti-price rise agitation. In Gujarat with the Navnirman movement, and in Hyderabad with the Progressive Organization of Women, in Ahmedabad with the formation of Self-Employed Women's Association, the first women's trade union in the country, triggered this resurgence. Change did not come about till the 1970s, when state-led development planning showed its first sign of crisis. At this time, a range of new social movements emerged, including the efflorescence of women's movement through street agitation and massive grassroots mobilization. Women's movements in the 70s and 80s took up issues of violence, domestic violence, rape by police, dowry, high food prices, and personal law. The biggest shock, especially to those educated upper class women who had fought for independence, was that the state had failed to keep its constitutional guarantee of equality for more than 2 decades. A report produced for the first UN Conference on Women in 1974, or the Declaration by the United Nations in 1975 of the UN Decade for Women 1975 to 1985, demonstrated that women were not only invisible from the development process, But for the majority rural women and women in the urban informal sector, conditions of deprivation had worsened. Consequently, women's movements from the very different positions were radical left, which sought to expose the state's class interests. The left liberal groups which sought policy reforms and the autonomous women's groups which sought legal redresses could all demand that the state respond to feminist concerns. In the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, a whole slew of legal reforms were enacted, including laws against dowry, rape, and prenatal diagnostic tests, which were used to selectively abort female fetuses, and laws to end sex trafficking and rape within marriage. A national policy on women in the informal sector 1988 and a national perspective plan for women were issued. In the early 1990s, the state introduced sweeping constitutional reforms. A third of the seats to local government positions at village and 2 levels above were reserved for women. As a result of these quotas, women in India were now elected as village heads. Towards equality was followed by another path-breaking report in 1988, famously known as the Shram Shakti report, which was a detailed documentation of women working in the informal or unorganized sector in India, which is where almost 90% women work. The publication and findings of these two reports galvanized both the women's movement as well as the nascent discipline of women's studies, as activists felt the need for concrete information and analysis to enable them to deal with the situation on the ground. And researchers and academics realized the importance of collating, analyzing, and theorizing on the basis of empirical data and the lived experiences of women. Academics and activists forced the government and policymakers to acknowledge the systematic discrimination against women and to evolve policies and programs that would genuinely empower them and enable them to take their rightful place in their country, its social, economic, and political life. It has been one of the most important social and political movements in the 20th century. This brings us to the conclusion of this module. To revise the highlights of the social reform movements, please keep in mind these dates. 1825, sati was outlawed. 1876, widow remarriage legalized. 1870, Special Marriage Act passed to allow intercommunity marriage. 1891, age of consent revised to 12 years. 1921, women got the right to vote in Madras. 1937, women get limited rights to property. 1929, Sarda Act, or the prohibition of child marriage of below 14 and 18 years for girls and boys respectively. Some of the developments not discussed here but are equally important would include the Women's Reservation Bill. We request you to kindly read up about it through the internet or other sources. Education for Women's Equality, the Total Literacy Campaign, and the Women's Development Program have made an enormous difference, especially to poor women. Laws prohibiting dowry and special measures to deal with domestic violence have brought about this widespread practice to public, police, and judicial attention. Many men and women, and mostly women, are crusading against the social abuses and fight for gender justice with a vision of culture of equality. Thank you.